I'm excited to introduce Steve Cartwright, who is the founder of Exponent Education, and he's also a national education data expert. He did all the analysis for us that we're going to share with you tonight. He also elevated the most salient trends. So, Steve, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Tanisha. It's great to be with everyone this afternoon. I'm really excited to be here and, as Tanisha said, share the most recent data that we've obtained on student achievement throughout Missouri and, of course, here locally in St. Louis. I've been working with education data for 15 years at this point, and honestly, I don't think there's ever been a more important time to tune into what the data are telling us about the state of our schools. Just a few quick words about my background. I started my research career at a think tank called the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., which is where I still live today. I spent a number of years working in the DC public schools, supporting the district with research and analysis. And as Tanisha said, most recently, I've been consulting across the country through my company, Exponent Education, doing all sorts of data work with schools and school systems and support organizations and others. So it's really my pleasure to be with everyone today. This presentation has three main components, after which, as Brandy said, we'll pause and create some space for questions and discussion. The first component focuses on the impact of the pandemic on student achievement nationally. So we're going to be looking at data from something called the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's also called the Nation's Report Card. Essentially, those data from that assessment provide the most apples to apples comparison of how students perform across state lines. So we can look at how Missouri students are doing relative to the nation. In the second component, we'll examine data released just in December by Missouri's Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. It's those data that will let us look at achievement at the school and district and regional levels. And they also provide a window into how students are recovering from the effects of the pandemic, because we have achievement information from 2021 and 2022. And then finally, we'll explore what we can learn from schools that are outliers. So those schools and systems that are changing the odds, and in particular, helping Black students in the St. Louis region achieve outsized gains from 2021 to 2022 on the road to recovery. So let's jump in and start with a look at the national data. So the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP for short, is a valid, reliable assessment that's administered in every state and the District of Columbia, and it's been administered for decades. So it really provides this rich, comprehensive national view of student achievement. Students test in grades 4 and 8 in reading and math, as well as in some other content areas. So before the pandemic, in the years leading up to 2019, there were significant improvements in the average achievement of students nationally in both 4th grade reading and 8th grade math. Those are the trend lines here on this page. And this progress was significant. You can see here that the average student moved from closer to a basic level of content mastery on the assessment to really midway toward the proficiency standard, which represents full mastery of content standards. And those improvements over that time frame roughly corresponded with two major chapters of federal education policy. The first was No Child Left Behind, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with. It was authorized in 2002 and placed a really heavy emphasis on assessment and accountability for the performance of all student groups in a school. It was very equity focused. The second chapter really began in 2009 when the Obama administration announced a program to offer states flexibility from the requirements of No Child Left Behind through a program called Race to the Top. That program really prioritized more rigorous standards that were aligned to college and career readiness indicators, and also more rigorous systems for teacher evaluation. Congress also reauthorized No Child Left Behind as the Every Student Succeeds Act in 2015, at which point the achievement increases of a decade and a half generally plateaued. And as we all know, unfortunately, the modern era of national student achievement has largely been characterized by the staggering impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. You can see here the significant declines in test performance nationally from 2019 to 2022, and particularly in math. I really want to spend a moment thinking about the gravity of these declines. 8th graders declined 8 points in math performance. And you might wonder, okay, well, how much really is 8 points? Well, when you look at how average achievement had been trending before the pandemic, 8 points is nearly all of the gains made over the 2 decades from 2000 to 2019. 4th graders fortunately declined less in reading performance, but still their 3-point loss is almost half of the gains made over those same 2 decades. And of course, we all know from the research and our firsthand experiences, the myriad other impacts that the pandemic's had on student and teacher and family health and well-being that go so far beyond what's reflected in these test scores. So now let's look at Missouri. In Missouri, average student achievement was roughly on par with students nationally prior to the pandemic. However, you can see here the significant achievement gap faced by Black students within Missouri. We'll focus here and elsewhere in the presentation on Black student performance because those students face the greatest inequities in the St. Louis region and also given the mission of the Opportunity Trust. In 4th grade reading, Black student performance declined 14 points from 2019 to 2022, which is almost 3 times the rate of decline experienced by the average student in Missouri. As a result, the so-called achievement gap for Black students widened from 19 points back in 2003 to 27 points in 2022. The amount of that decline, just to put it in context, is more than almost every other state. Only 2 states Black students were more impacted, and only 1 state, Maine, has lower performing Black students overall as of 2022. In 8th grade math, unfortunately, the trend is similar. Black students experienced an 8-point gain from 2003 to 2019 in Missouri. During the pandemic, however, those students lost 12 points, which is more than all the gains seen during those 2 prior decades. Again, nationally, only 5 states saw larger declines for 8th grade Black students, and Missouri now ranks 4th from the bottom in 8th grade math performance nationwide for Black students. So with that national picture in mind, we can now turn to the new data released by DESE in December. The 2022 state test results let us make comparisons not just to pre-pandemic performance back in 2019, as the NAEP just did nationally, but actually to 2021 performance. So we can determine just how much schools are rebounding or recovering from the effects of the pandemic. And the DESE data also, of course, allow us to examine results by community, district, and school. So let's start with reading, also known as English Language Arts, or ELA for short. From 2021 to 2022, the percent of students that scored proficient or advanced on the Missouri State Test, which essentially identifies students who have mastered grade level state standards, continued to fall. Less than half of students statewide and also in St. Louis County met those standards in 2022. I'm not particularly surprised by this result. We saw in 2021 and also in data from communities across the country that the pandemic had less of an overall effect on students' reading proficiency when compared with math. And so I think what we're seeing here now is sort of the accumulating effect of 3rd graders now in this tested sample who spent most of their 1st and 2nd grade years during the pandemic. Locally, when we look at the city, while overall performance is worse, St. Louis charters and SLPS schools both saw modest improvements from 21 to 22. There was a 1 percentage point increase in charter proficiency and a 2 percentage point increase in proficiency in SLPS. Still, of course, no sector in the city is back to their pre-pandemic level of performance, which in and of itself was not particularly strong, as we all know. Even before the pandemic, fewer than 1 in 3 students was proficient in charters and less than 1 in 4 was proficient in SLPS. Before I go on, I just want to note that you'll see this little customize this chart button on this and other slides. I want to say that all of these data and the charts that we're looking at are available on the Trust's new Learning to Improve website, which you'll hear a little bit more about later. So you can analyze the data yourself if you want to explore these results for a specific grade level or a specific student group or in specific schools or districts or content areas. There's fortunately better news statewide and locally in mathematics. So consistent with data that we're seeing in other states and communities, students in St. Louis experienced larger initial declines in math compared to ELA from 2019 to 2021 when schools first went remote. And students are seeing some rebounding or positive improvement from 21 to 22. So no sector is back to its 2019 pre-pandemic achievement level, but these improvements, I think, are really significant. So math proficiency increased by 4 points statewide, 7 points in county schools, St. Louis County schools, 6 points among St. Louis charters, and by 3 points in SLPS schools. So to put this in context, that 6 percentage point gain among St. Louis charter schools means that more than 360 additional students tested proficient in 2022 compared to 2021. And in our community, the size of this community, that's a lot. It's also worth saying a word about participation rates here. In SLPS, we saw that those schools tested a significantly smaller percentage of students in 2022 than in the prior year, almost 1,000 fewer students, and the participation rate went down. Those declines in the participation rate were largest among historically lower performing groups. In charter schools, the participation rate was much higher, and so there might be some kind of upward effect on the SLPS results that's coming from that change in participation. So I just thought it was worth mentioning. Another important caveat to note before we go on is that looking at those SLPS results in the aggregate belies a large and really unfortunate inequality between, on the one hand, the vast majority of students who are enrolled in open enrollment schools, and on the other, the small minority of students who are admitted into the city's various selective admissions schools. Open enrollment schools account for more than 80% of school enrollment, which is about 6,500 students. Those selective schools test a much smaller number, about 1,200 students. And as you can see here, proficiency rates tend to be 6 to 8 times higher in those selective admissions schools, which pulls up that district average by a non-trivial amount. Those selective admissions schools also improved more from 21 to 22. So just keep in mind here that the vast majority of students enrolled in SLPS are in open enrollment schools with very low levels of performance, lower even than the district average that we've been looking at. So beyond the aggregate results, which represent students in all the grade levels, it's also important to look at progress in the grade level data, and particularly in grades 3 and 8. As I'm sure you know, there's a lot of research on the early predictors of students' later academic and life outcomes, like whether or not they'll graduate high school on time, whether or not they're likely to graduate high school on time, I should say, and whether or not they're displaying indicators of college or career readiness. These predictive milestones really begin with kindergarten readiness, which is a measure of students' developmental preparedness for school. We know, for example, that students that attend a high-quality pre-K program are more likely to demonstrate school readiness and more likely to master grade-level content throughout elementary school. The next major milestone is really reading proficiently by the end of 3rd grade. Research shows that students achieving proficiency in 3rd grade are much more likely to be able to access the rigor of the curriculum in future grade levels and achieve higher levels of educational attainment across their academic journey. Math proficiency in grade 4 is also predictive of students' later success in upper level math courses. That's likely because of the importance of fractions as a sort of power standard. That's a content standard that's really foundational to mastering other math concepts. And then finally, mastery of 8th grade math skills ensures students have the essential concepts down for everyday life, and also that students are in a position to complete a full high school math sequence, which will best prepare them for college or career. So we're going to drill into grade 3 reading and grade 8 math results, 2 specific milestones, because of the strength of the evidence on their predictive power. So here, let's start with 3rd grade ELA results. And you'll see initially that they're similar to what we saw overall, which are continued declines statewide and some small increases locally. On this page, you're looking, though, not just at the overall percent of students who are proficient or advanced, but actually the percentage of students at each of the test's 4 performance levels. Importantly, as we drill down into these specific grade level results, we're not able to compute a fully accurate result for the charter sector. The gray boxes you'll see here and elsewhere indicate the percent of students whose results couldn't be determined based on how the state publishes test scores. But still, we think there's a lot to learn from these results by level. So here you can see below the line of the percent of students not proficient, what percentage performed at a basic level of mastery, that's in the yellow or orange, as well as the percent of students at the below basic level of mastery in red. And in both sectors, at least 50% of our youngest students are reading at the below basic level. Given that third grade marks an important shift from students move from learning to read to really reading in order to learn, these below basic students are unprepared to access rigorous curriculum in grades 4 and up. I want to just read you a quick quote from the Missouri Learning Standards that describes students' performance at the below basic level. They write that students at this level, quote, demonstrate little or no ability to organize and or develop writing or exhibit little command of the conventions of standard English. So that's a really significant and powerful result. In the charter sector, that below basic percentage is approximately 50. It could be as high as 57%, given that we don't know the scores of 7% of charter students here. In SLPS, that figure is nearly 2/3 of third graders, or 65%. So of the more than 1,200 third grade students that tested in SLPS's open enrollment schools, that's the vast majority of students in this statistic, nearly 900 of those third graders were below basic. Let's turn now and look at 8th grade math, so a little bit farther down the academic journey. This is really how today's 9th graders performed last spring. As we saw earlier, proficiency rates have been rebounding statewide and locally, which is great news. That improvement in proficiency rates has also been accompanied by pretty significant reductions in the percent of students scoring below basic, so that red category, both statewide and in the county. Locally, the charter sector also appeared to significantly reduce that percentage of below basic students. But as with the third grade results, not all the test scores could be incorporated into this particular analysis. In SLPS, so at the far right, the percentage of below basic 8th graders increased actually to nearly 3/4 of the 8th grade class. So that essentially means that the vast majority of SLPS students entering high school this year really will need significant intervention to master the skills required to engage in a full high school math sequence. So I know that's a lot of new data. I want to just finally turn our attention to the final component of our analysis, which attempts to kind of look at the variability in these results and find schools and school systems that are achieving outlier status and really improving achievement at faster rates than average. To find these outliers, we want to look beyond just the crude proficiency rates at each district and school, because as you saw with the grade level results a moment ago, there are actually 4 levels of performance on the Missouri assessment. And given the impact of the pandemic, we want to find schools that aren't just moving students above the proficiency threshold, but we also want to detect improvement for students that are farthest behind. And so we can do this by computing an index that captures how many students are at each of the 4 levels of performance in any given year. Here we're looking at Black student performance by level. Statewide, you can see that Black students did not improve in ELA, with no real change in the percent of students scoring at any of these categories. On the other hand, at Momentum, which is a local charter network, we see not just an improvement in the percent of Black students who are advanced, that percentage increased by 2 points, but also a really meaningful reduction in the percent of Black students scoring below basic and a corresponding increase in the percent of students, Black students in this case, scoring at the basic level. So it's this kind of holistic, positive upward movement of students across the 4 levels of performance that I think best helps tell the story of year-over-year change, especially during this pandemic period. So we've computed these index measures for all schools and all systems, and you can find those data on our website. When we subset that list, though, to just those systems whose student enrollment is at least 50% Black students, and also sort them on how much their performance index changed from 2021 to 2022, in ELA in this case, we identify a mix of outliers, and they're both charter and district. So I'm going to drill into the top 3 examples here in ELA, but just know that you can get this full data set on our website if you want to find outliers for other groups or in other content areas as well. So statewide and in St. Louis County, as we saw, proficiency rates for Black students in ELA improved modestly, basically next to no improvement from 21 to 22, very little change in the percent of students scoring below basic, which again is that red category. Compare that though to University City, right next door, where the percentage of students scoring advanced increased, as well as the percent scoring proficient, as well as a reduction in the percent of students scoring below basic. When you look at the data this way, Black students in University City improved at 15 times the rate of Black students countywide. As another comparison, consider those open enrollment SLPS schools, which also saw some modest improvements in ELA. When you look at Kairos academies and Momentum, Black students improved at 2 to 3 times the rate of those district-run schools. In both those campuses, you can see significant reductions in the percent of Black students scoring at that lowest level of performance, and also increases in students at the proficient and advanced levels, or both. Those gains are substantial. They might look small, but they are substantial, and they can also be really instructive if we're able to get under the hood, so to speak, and learn about what practices are really driving their success. And also, I think the mere existence of these outlier schools shows us what's possible. Many of these schools are serving entirely historically disadvantaged student populations, and they're achieving, in some cases, life-changing results. So as we wrap up the data story, I just want to end with a short thought experiment. We just looked at 3 inspiring examples of what's possible. Those schools are changing the odds for Black students and presenting a new possibility. Now consider for a moment our current citywide proficiency rates. So that's both the district schools and charters combined. They're at just 15% in ELA and 9% proficient in math. But what if every school were able to implement the approaches that are in practice in those outliers? So as an illustration, if every school in the city improved at the rate of Momentum for the next 5 years, and keep in mind that it's improving proficiency by less than 3 points in ELA and less than 7 points in math. In that scenario, citywide achievement would improve dramatically. In ELA, in this example, we'd be able to close the statewide achievement gap by half, and in math, we'd outperform the state average. And improvements of this magnitude aren't just reflected in test scores. So remember that the best available research shows us that students with higher test scores, or essentially higher test scores, increase students' probability of attending college. They can raise students' lifetime earnings. They can reduce teenage birth rates, and they can also improve the quality of the neighborhoods in which students live in adulthood. So while the road to recovery will of course be challenging, I think these examples show what is possible. And just to wrap up the thought experiment, imagine you're teaching a class of 30 students, which is larger than average for the region. In any given year, you'd need to move 1 additional student to proficiency in ELA and 2 additional students to proficiency in math to achieve that type of improvement. So surely something better is possible. That concludes our analysis.